Hey, we're so glad you're tuning in today to this conversation. This is the first podcast conversation we've had. And so we've got myself, Sherry, my wife is here, Bryce and Megan, the other half of the Banditos.
Let's do it.
That was dumb.
Banditos. I like that. Can we make shirts?
And so today we're having a Q&A conversation about some of the questions that were submitted in last month's series. You guys did what series was it?
We called it Don't Get It Twisted, when the goal was really just to kind of debunk some of the myths around dating and how to date the right way, and try to meet teenagers where they are in terms of how they view dating, why they feel like they need it in their life, and battling the societal pressures of dating at their age. So
beautiful.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
loved it.
And hopefully, if you are on DYA's channel, you've already listened to a couple of the EXO messages from last month's series. If you haven't, jump back and check those out. If you're on the Discovery students, jump back and check out their sermons as well. So you're kind of up to date on what we've already been talking about in these series. But let's jump in. This is actually going to be two separate episodes. This one we're going to talk about dating, purity, boundaries, celibacy. No, I'm just kidding.
Chastity belts.
Yes, because that's a thing. So let's just jump right in. Bryce, throw a question out there and we'll get to conversating.
Yeah, one of the questions that I think, if they're being completely honest, a lot of them ask this question, but in different ways. And I'd love to hear kind of some thoughts and just have conversations about it. But basically the whole concept and prospect of, like, if all sin is equal, why do Christian leaders and pastors and Christians make such a big deal about premarital sex, premarital, relational, crossing those boundaries at before you're married? Why is it such a big deal if all sin is equal? Do you want to start it off?
Sure, I'd love to. No, I think that's a big misconception. Is a lot of times in the church the perspective is like we rank sins, and a lot of times I think we've all heard the saying said, like, love the sinner, but hate the sin.
Yeah.
And we like to say that, but I think that's harder to really believe and walk out than it is to say. And so then when it comes to ranking sins, and it seems like that churches and youth pastors and adult pastors and pastors in general preach so much on sexual purity, being holy in this area of your life. And the scripture that I go to so often is that when you are involved in sexual immorality, the reason that it affects you so greatly is because it's not a sin that simply affects somebody else, but it affects yourself. It affects your own body, your own soul. And all sin does, but it affects you in a different way. The emotional, the spiritual baggage that it instantly brings. Sex was a part of the covenant that God put in place at the very beginning of creation. And so with every time that you allow yourself to be part of a relationship in that way that's outside the covenant that God put in place, you're almost leaving part of yourself that was meant to be solely intended for the person that God has for you. You're leaving parts of you with each person that you're involved with. And so that's why I think so many people struggle to find healing from these kinds of issues, is because it leaves them feeling like there's a void, like they've left part of them in a previous relationship because of the elements of covenant relationship that was there outside of marriage. And so,
no, that's great. And I think too, realizing why it's such a big deal is what you said, to piggyback off of what you said, is like, it's the way God intended for you to bond. It's the way God intended for you to 100% solidify. That's why it's in the context of marriage. Because I was reading an article talking about the chemical, things that take place, and on a physiological level, what happens is when you engage in sexual activity with a partner, there's a chemical in your brain that's released called oxytocin. And what that chemical is used for is to bond to another person. That's why God created it in, again, the context of marriage. It's the same chemical that's released in mothers when they nurse infants. It's a trust-building, bond-building chemical. Yeah. And what people don't realize is that it's not just sex. It's not just giving, part of your physical body over, but what you said earlier, it's giving really part of who you are, your soul, your heart, over to a person that probably doesn't deserve it. Yeah. There's an illustration that came to my mind with it, and we'll kind of move on after this, but the whole concept of it's kind of like you're a puzzle, right? Yeah. And every time you have maybe a sexual encounter, or maybe you give yourself over to another person, you're giving them a piece of your puzzle. And the problem with that is one day when you give yourself over to a spouse is if you're not careful and if you don't allow Jesus to put you back together because we're made a new creation in him, then you're going to give your spouse, an incomplete, missing puzzle piece, picture that they're not even going to recognize. And it's going to be damaged and it's going to be hard to identify and all that. So that's at the end of the day, you got to protect your heart above all things. So for sure.
Anybody else?
Well, I think too, because you said like the students think that we preach about it all the time, or it's just, I think it's because it's something that all of them deal with.
Yeah.
And so maybe they feel that conviction, and maybe not every single message they're like, oh, this affects me. But a lot of times that is one. So they feel like they talk about this all the time because it's something that they need to hear, and it's something that is convicting to them whenever they do hear it.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Nice.
Good. Next question?
Yeah, you want to do it?
Yeah, let's go to the next one. Should I be actively pursuing a significant other? Which actively pursuing is kind of an interesting phrase there.
Actively.
Actively pursuing, like should I be stalking?
Farmers only.
Should I creepily?
Or should I be actively pursuing them, or should I just wait for that person to just come into my life and show up?
That's great.
Sherry,
I choose you.
to win.
I choose you.
When we did this a couple Wednesday nights ago, I was like, this is such a weird question, but my initial answer was like, absolutely, in prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
It's really
I feel like a lot of times pursuing in our society is like going on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette or like dating constantly. And I don't think there's anything wrong with dating, but as Christians and as for us, for young adults, like pursuing can mean in prayer and not like praying for John Smith to fall in love with you,
He's a good-looking man.
but for that person that God has intended for you.
That's
Yeah.
so good.
Yeah, that's so awesome.
Actively pursuing doesn't have to look like sliding into DMs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
To your
sure.
point.
I'm 31. I don't know what that means.
No, but it's kind of like even this past Sunday night, we had a guest speaker with us, and he was talking about the idea of, he used as an illustration of letting God into your boat, letting Jesus into your boat, that a lot of times we try to take a hold of the oar and just row and row and row and just kind of force our way through situations and seasons in our own strength and in our own ability. And when you're constantly dating, or you're constantly trying to quote unquote better yourself so that people will like you or so that someone will date you, trying to gain that significant other, you've taken the boat into your own hands.
Right.
And his whole idea Sunday night was let God into your boat. You weren't intended to do this on your own. And so that's exactly what you're saying, is that a lot of times the best thing that you can do is pray, God, whoever that person is, bring them into my life. And even more than that, God, prepare me and help me to become the person that I need to be, so that when that person comes into my life, that relationship can be healthy. Because I think a lot of times the person, that may be your future significant other may already be in your life.
Right.
And maybe you're just not ready, you're in yourself for that relationship yet. And God needs to work in you a little bit more before he brings that person in.
That's what it is. What I like to think of is fundamentally when you take matters into your own hands and you start actively pursuing and trying to force a relationship, what you're doing is by nature telling God, like, I'm going to do this on my own without you. Right. And that's super dangerous, because then the element of like, you're not trusting God with what you're saying, rowing the boat. So that's one thing, is like, one thing I love, and it's as cliche and cheesy, and we haven't even talked about this, but like, there's a lady at our church, Crystal Dillon.
Shout out.
Shout out.
Pastor Crystal.
Shout out K. Dillon.
She
one.
did this really cool. Yeah, there's 5. She did this really cool thing to where she kind of made a list, like writing it to her teenage self. But it's really cool because she, in our context, she with our small groups and with girls that are older in high school. Anyway, the whole premise behind it was writing a list of like, you can be actively pursuing your significant other, your spouse, by creating a list of what you want in a spouse. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that way, when the day comes where maybe you realize that person's in your life, or God allows that person to be in your life, you can check your list that you feel like has been God inspired, right? That you want not only, and this is another thing too, is like, oh man, okay. Long story short, there was a, I'm going to say it about 15 more times.
Which means the story's about to get really long.
Dang it. I hate that I say that. Early on, and this is something I shared on a Wednesday once, but I was very attracted to Megan, and I'll be honest with you, that's the reason why we started. super unhealthy.
Yep.
Just like, man, she's hot. I'm gonna message her.
Can you tell all of the
Facebook.
listeners what
God.
your original line was to Megan?
I
Since
wish-
you're talking about her physical looks.
I wish you wouldn't have told me that. I walked up to her and I thought I was incredibly smooth, and it was at a church camp, which there's worse places you can meet. I walk up to her and I'm like, man, this girl's hot. I gotta say something real smooth, and there was pressure there. And I walk up to her and I was like, hey, is your mom pretty too? Like complimenting her and her mom at the same time. I thought it was a brilliant move. Megan's
good.
response was, I guess. She literally was like so weirded out. Like, I guess. Anyway, early on, our relationship was initiated maybe by physical attraction, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But basically, I had a person in my life say this thought to me, like, don't think about just the physical looks behind it. Think about how she's going to be when you're grandparents. And that is something that as a 19-year-old kid, I had never thought about. Like, think about how does that make sense?
Sherry's face.
Does that make sense?
Like old?
Yeah. Well, the point well, now I feel stupid. I'm just kidding. The whole point was like, think about how she's going to treat kids. Don't just think about how pretty she is. Think about how she's going to be as a grandparent, how loving, how compassionate,
Over the next
patient.
60, 70 years together.
Right.
Yeah,
What does
that it's
look
not
like?
just for short term,
Because-
but long term.
And the whole thing is because beauty fades, right? Like you're not going to look the same as you're 7 years old. So that's the whole thing. Back on this thing, you can actively pursue somebody not by physically going after them, right? Like you were saying earlier, but actively pursuing like what you want in a spouse. I think that's
Yeah.
something really important. Yeah.
I did a list too, and a lot of people make fun of Joseph because he shaves, but I prayed for a non-hairy person, and
You got
I didn't even have to ask him to shave. He just does it on his own.
Everybody needs a naked mole rat in their life.
Heck.
My.
I don't think I've ever wanted that in my life. What, are you a swimmer? Why do you shave
Kim Possible
your legs?
did. She wanted one. She did.
Ron Stobble. Why do you shave your legs? Tell the people. Tell the people what they want to know. Why do you shave every part of your
Because
body?
I actively pursued that when I was 13.
She actively pursued my
God.
fresh shaven calves.
Okay, this is taking a turn.
moving
Yeah.
on from my bald calves. Hey, so let's actually go back to something that you brought up with the thing that Crystal did with making the list, and
Yeah.
kind of jump to a new question. That we're actually going to skip a question and then we'll come back. Talk about making that list of what it looks like in that future spouse. And we've got a question on here. What if I fall in love with someone who doesn't line up with my morals? Or let's say, what if I fall in love with someone who doesn't line up with this list or this idea of what I feel like a godly spouse should look like? What do I do with that?
I think maybe it needs to start at the root of it, of getting into a relationship, even with somebody. Maybe you need to start farther back. Maybe if you've already fallen in love with them, that's one thing and you can pray for them. But I think that's a different issue almost of why are you dating in the first place? Or are you, like, at what point of your dating
Right.
relationship are you in?
Right.
Yeah. Or do you feel like your soul's ready to be that invested? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or just like, what if I fall in love with someone who doesn't line up with my morals? Like, are you already at
Like,
that
why-
point?
why were you dating in
or
the first
or
place?
why are you getting in that relationship if they don't line up with your morals? Are you
Yeah.
already there, or are you thinking ahead of
Yeah.
schedule right now?
What's so great about this question, because so many people asked a similar question to this. They're like, but you don't understand, this boy or this girl, they make me feel so great, or they make me, the butterflies are there. But like, this is something I heard in a podcast, and I'm totally going to just say it, and I don't remember who said it, but this is not an original thought. But basically, what
Whoever
the
you
Bible
are, you get credit.
I know, like I don't want to like epiphany, but the whole premise of like God is love. Biblically
Yeah.
speaking, the definition of love is God, right? And we know this about God, that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So love does not change. Therefore, love is not a feeling.
Yeah.
Because feelings change,
Right.
right? You get
Yeah.
hurt, you get happy, you feel cared for, you have butterflies because you're attracted to that person, they give you attention,
Yeah.
and then 2 weeks later they cheat on you and you're like, oh, stabbed in my heart,
Yeah.
That is not love. That's
Right.
feelings. And so when you say I fall in love with the person who don't line up with our morals, I would say that's really hard to do, almost impossible. Because if they don't line up with the person that you feel like
Yeah.
God has for you, then it's probably not love, if
Right.
that makes sense,
Right.
It's a feeling that they give you. And it's very natural and very human to be like, well, I want this feeling, I want this reciprocation,
Right.
I want to feel accepted and all that. But at the same time, you need to decipher it's not love, right?
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
maybe what God has for you. The one thing I say all the time is just because that person may be good for you doesn't mean it's who God has for you.
Right.
Like the reality is you're not in a relationship to make you better. You're in a
Right.
relationship so that person can make you better. You
Right.
know, like you would back me up on this. Like
Oh, yeah.
Megan is a pastor to me a lot of times.
Yeah,
You know what I'm
same.
saying? Like in ministry and in life in general, like that's the thing is Megan makes me better. And that's one of the things that strengthens our love. That was the cheesiest sentence ever. Strengthens our love. You know?
Megan's a pastor to all of us.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, how many times is there those seasons like in marriage where like you're strong and
Yep.
and you have to be there for your spouse and whatever the season is, and in the next season it may be roles reversed, right? And you have
So
to be there
true.
for that person.
Yeah.
And I think just the question in general, I think is a little flawed. What if I fall in love? Because you don't fall into love. We know talking about your
Right.
definition of love. Love's a choice. Like you choose to love somebody. Like when Sherry and I were dating,
great.
it was to a point where Sherry was my best friend. I trusted her.
Yeah.
I had feelings for her. I had fallen into feelings and affection and things like that. But then you choose to love that person
Yeah.
because love is a commitment.
Yeah.
Love is a choice that you make that I am choosing to commit my life to this person forever, right? Like this,
Yeah.
this is my person. And so I think a lot of times when they're asking a question like this, it's what do I do when I fall into attraction? What do I do
That's what it
when
is.
I fall into
great.
feeling? And how
Yeah.
do I reconcile these feelings? And my answer to anybody who's asking about what do I do with what I feel is never make a decision in that moment.
So good.
Because if you commit to something or if anything in your life is based on what you feel, that foundation in the next season is going to completely crumble.
Yeah.
Because as quickly as that
Absolutely.
feeling is there, it's going to be
Yeah.
gone. And then what are you left with?
Right.
And so that's why not even dating, but just making life choices and life decisions, take those things to God in prayer. Don't make a decision based in feeling,
Yeah.
based in what looks good in the moment. Weigh that out before God, weigh it out before the Lord in prayer, and see where that lands.
That's
So,
great. Well, one thing too, like Christianity in general, our Christianity is not based on feelings.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
That's the thing is like they don't realize, and then this is the thing is like respectfully speaking, I think a lot of teenagers, again, in our context of
Yeah.
youth ministry, a lot of teenagers, maybe their thought process isn't like, I lost train of thought, but they don't understand. Well, I forgot what I was saying. Dang. What were you just saying? Oh, feelings. Yeah, they're just like feelings of love or whatever.
Uh-huh.
But they don't realize necessarily that they can't decipher the difference between love and feelings.
Right.
There was to piggyback off, and we'll move on because I know we spent a lot of time on this. But there was a a show recently on Netflix that won't be named, for copyright purposes. But there was there was probably a conversation with one of the contestants on there, and she was like, "I don't have the butterflies anymore. I'm
And
falling
it
out
was
of."
like a week later.
Yeah. It was 2 weeks, literally a week into the whole process. It was like an experiment dating. I'm sure you can figure out what show it was. Anyway, she's like, I want those butterflies back. How do I get those butterflies back? And the reality is people need to know you're not always going to have butterflies in a
Right.
relationship
Right.
because it's based on feelings. Anyway,
Well, and I think it's the same thing in our relationship with God. Like let's take it even a step further.
Yeah.
Is a lot of times we had an incredible service this past weekend and talking with some of our students, they were talking about like the spiritual high they were on coming off of Sunday night. Well, that's feeling, right? And we've all
Yeah.
been in a relationship and following Jesus long enough to know that sometimes you feel it,
yep.
sometimes you don't.
feel it.
As pastors, as worship leaders, as as people involved in ministry, there's days that you walk out on the platform and you feel it. There's days you walk
Yeah.
out and you don't.
Yeah.
There's days even in your faith when you open your Bible just to get closer to God in your own walk that you don't feel it, that you don't feel like trusting, you don't feel like saying yes, you don't feel like going another step on this journey. And that's where, again, when you choose love, when you choose commitment, it comes back to a choice.
Yeah.
That I make this choice to do this in the
So much
same way with a
deeper.
relationship, in the same way with God. I don't base it on feelings. I don't base it on just what I see. I base it on the fact that I made a choice. I'm doing this. I'm committed to this. I'm all in. So
It's great.
Yeah.
So great. Well, let's do this if we can. Did you want to add anything?
No.
Great stuff. I want to say, in regards to purity and boundaries, can we go there for a second?
Let's go to purity and boundaries.
Because in all honesty, this is something that probably every young adult Christian and or
Yes.
person has about
Yeah.
like how far is too far.
Yep.
What are healthy boundaries in a relationship? So let's talk about that for a second, just in a conversation element. Like, first of all, how would you answer the question, how far is too far? I'm going off script.
I think I think that's just a general question, not even just about purity and boundaries, but sin in general that we get
Yeah.
a lot from students, from
Yep.
young adults is where's the line? How far? They want to know how close can I get to the edge?
Yeah.
Like looking at this table we're sitting at, how close can I live on the edge and not fall off the table, right?
Yeah.
And
Still go to
Exactly.
heaven.
and still
Yeah.
go to heaven,
Yeah.
right? Like, and so my thing is like, if you understand what it means to follow Jesus, and like if Christ is the center of the table, and to be a Christian is to be more like Christ, I don't need to be anywhere near the edge.
Yeah,
Like my goal is to be as close to the center as possible. And so I get the question, yes, and how far is too far? And obviously, I think anything that violates your personal convictions or something that lines up with the Word of God, obviously.
Yeah.
But anything that is, and I'm not going to get into the whole gateway conversation, but if there are specific actions with another person, certain settings that you're in, activities that you're involved in sexually or whatever with another person that are automatically leading you mentally to a place that you should not go, those are things you need to avoid. Jesus talks at length about redefining people's idea of what the law was. They're like, well, I didn't kill anybody or I didn't have an affair. And he's like, no. If you've had anger towards a person,
Right.
you've already committed it. If you've had a lustful thought, you've already
in
already
your
done
heart.
it. So
Yeah.
if you're doing things, if you're participating in things that are making your mind go to a place that are across the line, then I think you've already created the issue there without even committing whatever the idea of a sinful act may be in your mind. So,
That's great.
yeah.
I
Somebody
think
else speak to
it made me think of it because in your first, Joseph, in your first week of y'all's relationship series, you talked about like Adam and Eve and like the shame that they felt after they ate from the apple and all of that. And it made me think that was such a good way to tell students, like if you're going to feel shameful telling your future spouse about it one
Right.
day,
So good.
So good.
then that's too far.
Yeah.
And I think another thing is too of just pursuing holiness, and then you don't even have those questions of, okay, what can I do?
Yeah.
It's I don't want to even put myself in that position because I'm pursuing holiness, I'm pursuing God.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing too, is I think sometimes we take for granted, I don't know, just how far is too far. Like with society, and I'm not about to just make a general thing. Like I get it, but like the generation that we are serving, that we get to serve, we take for granted sometimes. People don't realize like how easy it is. Well, okay, they don't realize the priority they should be placing on saving themselves.
Right.
Like I had a
Yeah.
conversation on a Wednesday after we made this kind of commitment ceremony with one of the students, and she was just like, I feel like before tonight, I wasn't just going to throw myself at anybody. However, I didn't necessarily have it made up in my mind that I was saving myself for marriage. I was going to wait till I was in love. I was going to wait. But like we take for granted that because this was, one who goes to church. So it's at the end of the day, like you've got to establish those boundaries and those morals before you go into there.
Right.
Before you enter into a relationship. Anyway, we could talk a lot more
Well,
about
and we
that.
talked a lot about that even in one of our services of like when to set those boundaries.
Right.
And you've got to make those decisions long before you're in the moment. Like if you're actively trying to live a life that's holy, to be pure in your sexuality, then you cannot wait till you're in the moment to make those decisions. Those have to be made so far in advance. The illustration that I used is make the decision now, not when you're alone in your significant other's apartment at 1:30 a.m. and you've been watching Netflix for 2 hours. It's late. You don't want to drive home. What am I going to do?
Do now what you can't do later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Make that decision when you are in a healthy place, when temptation is not at its peak, but when you are spiritually more locked in.
But honestly, too, when the whole thing about boundaries and like, I like to illustrate it like, if you're in a dating relationship and you've allowed a door to be opened, like physically or sexually, it's not as easy as just closing that door.
Right.
Like a lot of times the illustration that I like to use is it's like that door was ripped off the hinges and you have to completely rebuild the board piece by piece
Yeah.
by piece
That's
because
good.
you start over.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah,
just
completely.
we made a mistake physically, we crossed the line, but it's okay, we'll just shut that door and go back. No,
Right.
like a lot of times you need a clean break, right?
Yeah.
You need to reestablish a lot of boundaries, you need to reaffirm, have accountability in your life, have somebody that you trust in your life because it's not as easy as shutting a door. Like
Right.
that more than anything, and we said this, like the number one attack I believe on young people's lives and their callings is going to be their purity.
Yeah.
Because it deals with everyone. Everyone has hormones.
Yeah.
Everyone has attraction to
Yeah.
people. So
Yeah.
that's going to be the number one attack. And so, do now what you can't do later. It's good.
Sure.
It's a great thought.
Next question.
Cool.
What is next?
How can, this is a purity and boundaries, and we'll kind of stay there for a second. How do I help my friends who are struggling with sexual purity? Skipping around.
I would say first that that's not your job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Focus on yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, you can always be an accountability partner with your friend, but they need to have a good relationship with Jesus on their own.
Well, and I think the difference is too, are they asking for your
Yeah.
help, or
Yeah.
are you trying to
Agree.
insert yourself
Yeah.
into their situation? Because it's a whole lot easier to try to point out someone else's flaws
Absolutely.
than it is to fix your own. And I think even sometimes some people will even take advantage of that to, instead of dealing with their own issue, they kind of get that feeling of like, you know, I don't even know how you want to word that, but like
Fix everybody else.
I've done good because like I'm made whole because I'm fixing everybody else, and the whole time,
Yeah.
you know, you've got that plank coming out of your own eye. Like,
Yep.
take care of yourself.
Yep.
And so, I think the question lies: are they asking you to be an accountability partner? Are they asking you to help, you know, them be holy? Because if they are, and they're desiring that kind of relationship,
Then-
then at that point,
Yeah.
then help hold them accountable, be involved in their life, have those conversations. But if you're going to do that, be consistent
Yeah.
and actually show up.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
a lot of times when it comes to accountability, it sounds great to start. It sounds great that we're going to have those conversations and we're going to be honest. But that's the key, is like you've got to be honest. Both people got to show up. Both people have to be consistent and be willing to be honest. Because if you're not, then you're creating this odd tension of they know
Right.
some of my stuff, but they don't know everything.
Yeah.
And honestly, it can put a lot of strain and potentially ruin the relationship. So
For sure. I would say this too, like only true freedom comes from like true vulnerability and true confession.
Absolutely.
Like people get that twisted. They're like,
Absolutely.
well, we just have an encounter with Jesus. But yeah, if you're not completely honest, and that's part of confessing your sins to one another.
Yeah.
So I would say this: if you're wondering how to like deal with friends who are, advising friends on who are struggling with sexual purity, be the friend to them that you feel like you would need if you were in that situation.
Absolutely.
You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
For sure.
You be the one to be consistent in their life,
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
loving in their life, showing them honor, but also, coupling it with truth.
Yeah.
And that's the difficult part. Is you're right. People get like this superiority complex. They're like, I'm help, and they need me in their life,
Yeah.
And in reality,
Right.
they're ignoring the plank in theirs. But be the friend that you would need in that same situation.
Right.
It's great.
Because the whole point and premise of that is like to help that person heal, right?
Right.
Like if you're involved in their life, and one of the things that we said in our second week of the series was that God cannot heal what you will not reveal.
That's great.
And so,
Yeah.
like, if you can't be honest about it, if you can't make yourself available and vulnerable, God can't heal that if we constantly keep it in hiding.
It's great.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, so we've talked so loud. I'm sorry. All right, so we've talked about kind of like how far is too far, or whatever. But we haven't necessarily gotten to the practical side of things, such as like what boundaries can you place in your life to protect yourself and things like that. So, Joseph, I wonder what you would say, and Sherry and Megan, what you would say to the practical side of what boundaries you can put in your life.
Yeah, for sure. It kind of goes back to what we said a little bit earlier, of at least the base of it, is not making that decision in the moment, but making it ahead of time. And
Yeah.
so one of the examples I used in our series was win the battle before the fight. So don't wait till you're in the middle of that. And we base that out of 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 18, when it says flee from sexual immorality. So I mean, like, run away from it, get
Right.
as far away. And so if you're not married, avoid married things. That's one of the things we said in our series. If you're not married, don't put yourself in married situations. Make the decision long before you're in the moment. Entertaining situations, entertaining relationships that can sabotage your commitment to holiness. I mean, get those completely out of your sphere, right?
Right.
So don't allow yourself to be in places where you know you're going to compromise.
Yep.
If you can't trust yourself to be alone with a person in private, then go on group dates. Don't allow conversations to go to a place that are going to cause you to be tempted, to cause you to fail from keeping your standards. I don't know, what's some practical things?
Well, one other thing you've preached before too, Joseph, well, maybe Bryce too, I don't know, is don't nap in the enemy's lap. And that's Samson and Delilah.
Yeah.
Like, he literally was laying in her lap, and that's,
Putting himself.
putting himself there. And then when we had table groups during this series, this EXO series. I was sitting at one of the tables with some of our young adults, and they were, I think it was Lauren Grisham, shout out, was talking about how, a Bible character literally ran away from Potiphar's wife.
Joseph.
Oh, Joseph. Okay. I was going to say Joseph.
It was me.
I
was
got
I.
nervous.
Yeah.
Too much pressure.
She ran.
Like you said, flee.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if all else fails, be like the people in the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, don't be like the people in the Bible. Don't
Well-
nap the enemy's lap.
Like Joseph.
And that Samson illustration, though, a lot of times, we've talked about this, that people think that the issue with Delilah, of him continuing to put himself in that environment, even though he knew that she was after wrong things in his life, and she
His
was trying
goodies.
to, being his hair, let's clarify.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah.
His strength, whatever. So a lot of times people think that was a new issue for him, but if you go back in the story,
yeah.
Obviously, we believe there's reconciliation, healing from this, but he had a failed marriage. He had already been involved in sexually immoral relationships with prostitutes and a lot of other stuff
Right.
previous in the story.
He'd already
And
been
then-
putting himself in those situations.
Exactly. This was a habit he was creating, and so when you do continually put yourself in those moments, you are creating habits of almost numbing yourself to that environment that this is okay.
Yeah.
I think that you also need to have a good know your identity in Christ, because I think it's so easy too if you put so much trust in your significant other whenever you're dating and they start to fail and want you to do things or send a picture or go do something that you don't want to do. I think that you need to have enough confidence to say no,
Yeah.
to not compromise your morals, and if need be, break up if they're not
Right.
who is somebody that's going to hold you to that standard. They're not somebody that you need to be with.
And that's
Yeah.
a question we're not going to get super into, but somebody had asked, if somebody breaks up with me because I won't
Yeah.
cross boundaries or cross lines. And, our answer to that was just, if they're leaving you and they're ending that relationship because of that, then they didn't deserve you.
They're
Yeah.
not
You
for
you
you.
could do a lot
Yeah.
better, because if they won't respect you in that, there's going to be a lot of other issues and situations in your relationship where respect and honor will not be there. And those are so
Absolutely.
crucial to a healthy relationship.
And to that point, it's such an important thing, because it's a very obvious connection that I'm going to try to make here, but it's also one that's overlooked. Is when you are finding yourself, if you're a guy or a girl out there that's finding themselves crossing boundaries that you've established for yourself sexually or physically with the person that you're dating, it really comes back to a lack of self-control.
Yeah.
So if it's a lack of self-control, it's an area that's more fundamentally flawed, if that
Yeah.
makes
Fruit of
sense.
the
In other
Spirit.
words, it's a fruit of the spirit, but it's in other words, it's not just going to manifest
Right.
in relationships,
In that.
but it's an
Right.
ultimate lack of self-control that you
Absolutely.
need to address before you enter into a
Yeah, that's the
relationship.
root of it.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what people don't realize in terms of dating. They're like, oh no, I can be at my girlfriend's house at 11 p.m. watching a movie and not get tempted. Like,
Right.
that's not the same thing, because sexual sin is different and
Absolutely.
it has a bigger effect. And so it's going back to what Sherry said and going back to what you said, is like not putting yourself in the situation to begin with,
Right.
because you're protecting yourself, you're protecting your future with this person. Again, it's the whole concept of, if you really care about this person and you feel like it's who God has for you, because that's at the end of the day why we date in the first
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
But if you really do care about this person, then you'll do whatever it takes to protect your future together.
Right.
Right. Not being perfect, but that, yeah.
Yeah. And we even talked about that, these principles and these issues are not just for when you're not married, but
Yeah.
when
Right.
you are married.
Yeah, exactly.
Protecting yourself and protecting your relationship. One of the things that we said, when you get married, the standard doesn't change. The stakes just get a lot
Yeah.
higher.
So good. Yeah.
And so
People think
these
that
are-
though.
Yeah, I know.
Seriously,
They do.
teenagers think that. They're like,
They do.
when
It's
you get married, you won't be
We're
tempted.
good. Yeah, we're good. And it's like, the same principle is the exact same. Are you entertaining conversations with people that are not your
Right.
spouse? Are you entertaining environments? Are you allowing
Watching
yourself
things.
watching things, being emotionally fulfilled by somebody, either through interactions, conversations, spending time with someone who's not your spouse? And like I say, the standards, those don't shift. They're
Right.
the exact same for holiness, for purity.
Right.
The stakes just get a lot higher, because now someone else is part of this relationship
Yeah.
and covenant, and that's at stake with you. So
Yeah. It's good. It's a legal contract there.
legal contracts.
Well, and a lot of
Binding.
times as pastors, and like when we were RAs, and then even like when I was in high school, like being on staff, air quote, at camp, like people would say, well, you just don't trust me to, be set my own boundaries or whatever. It's
Yeah.
not about trust. Like, we've all been there. We know
But
that
we
it's
don't trust
reality.
Because we wouldn't have trusted ourselves in the
You
Yeah.
need accountability.
Yeah.
We've been there. Yeah.
I remember one time at camp I did something stupid, and our camp director in this conversation after he's disciplining me and where he's telling me how things are going to be from this point forward, and he even made that statement. He was like, "It's not that I just don't trust you. I wouldn't have trusted myself in that situation."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's where you have to understand when those kind of things are being put in place, those conversations are happening. The people that are taking the time to have that conversation with you,
Yeah.
to put boundaries on you, it's not that they don't like you or that they hate you or anything like that. They care enough about you
Yeah.
and they want to protect you because they believe in you.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
well, I think we are out of time for this one. We've got another episode coming, a little bit of a conversation. This conversation just geared a little bit more towards marriage. And so if you want to jump over and check out the next episode, make sure on both podcast accounts, Discovery Students, Discovery Young Adults, you leave us a review, subscribe, and we look forward to you being with us in future episodes.
Sounds good.
Peace.
Please leave that in there.